Through the heavy, tinted glass of the limousine, the afternoon sun looked almost brittle. I sat in the deep leather seat, adjusting the pale yellow blanket around my 2-week-old daughter, feeling the steady rise and fall of her tiny chest against my collarbone. Outside, just 70 feet away, across the manicured lawn, a garden party was in full swing. It was a beautiful display. It was also happening on a property that did not belong to the woman playing hostess. I watched my mother-in-law, Colleen, throw her head back in a practiced laugh, holding a crystal flute of champagne as she charmed a circle of local socialites. She wore a lavender silk dress, her hair perfectly sculpted, gesturing expansively toward the blooming hydrangeas. My eyes, trained by years of reading between the lines of financial disclosures, caught the details she thought were invisible. The catering trucks discreetly parked near the service entrance bore the logo of the most expensive firm in the county. The white wooden chairs scattered across the grass were premium rentals, not standard. And then there was my husband, David. He stood near the edge of the patio, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He smiled when spoken to, but it was a thin, nervous expression that didn't reach his eyes. He kept glancing toward the driveway, as if waiting for a ghost to appear. He had no idea the ghost was already here, parked in the shade of the old oak tree, watching him. Colleen thought she had won. She thought I was still crying in a motel room across town, broken, bleeding, and entirely defeated by a system she manipulated. She didn't know I'd stopped crying on day 3. Grief is exhausting, but betrayal is a remarkable stimulant. The devastation of the last 14 days had crystallized into something completely different. It was cold, it was quiet, and it was meticulously documented. I traced the soft curve of my daughter's cheek with the back of my thumb. The low idle of the engine hummed beneath us, a steady vibration that grounded me in the present second. I was not the confused, hysterical woman they had banked on. I was exactly the person my father had raised me to be. The glass partition behind the driver's seat lowered with a quiet, electronic hum. "Mom?" the driver asked, his voice respectful in the cool, air-conditioned quiet of the cabin. "They're all gathered near the terrace now. Are you ready?" I looked out at the woman who stole my home, then looked over at the man who let her do it. I pulled the soft blanket tighter around my baby girl. "Yes," I quietly said, "I am. Before I tell you how I stepped out of that car, I need to say something plainly. If this sounds too cruel to be real, I understand." A woman 5 days postpartum, still bleeding, still sore, still trying to learn her baby's breathing, comes home and finds out her house has been sold out from under her. I know how that sounds. If I had not lived it myself, I might have shaken my head too. But every part of this story was documented. Not in gossip, not in family arguments, not in the dramatic version people tell over coffee. In filings, in bank records, in signatures, timestamps, transfer receipts, and court exhibits. I reconstructed those 2 weeks the same way my father taught me to reconstruct missing money. From the paper trail people leave behind when they think pain has made you too weak to notice. And if you have ever had someone look at your age, your grief, your illness, your exhaustion, or your tears, and decide that meant you could be handled, dismissed, or spoken over, then you will understand exactly why I'm telling this. Tell me where you are watching from. Your city, your country, wherever life has taken you. I read those comments. They remind me how many quiet people in this world have been underestimated, and how many of us learned eventually to keep receipts. That lesson saved my daughter and me, and before this is over, you will see how badly they miscalculated me. Before any of this happened, people called me steady. Not reckless, not easily dazzled. I noticed details because that was how I had been raised, and because people signing papers often reveal more in ink than they mean to say aloud. That habit did not make me suspicious then. It made me useful. Later, it saved me. My father was a forensic accountant. He could sit with statements, ledgers, tax filings, and escrow reports, and tell you where a marriage was rotting or which partner was stealing from a business. He died when I was 22, but he left me a discipline that stayed. He taught me that greed has patterns, and paper, if you let it, will always confess. After college, I became a paralegal at an estate planning firm. I worked with wills, trusts, deeds, powers of attorney, and beneficiary changes, all the tidy legal instruments families use while pretending love and money never touch. They always touch. You saw it in the pauses, the revisions, the sudden need for control once illness entered a conversation. Every file was really a family argument dressed in respectable language. Colleen first came to us as a client. Even now I remember the click of her heels before her face. She carried herself like a woman accustomed to being accommodated. Her estate plan was elaborate, but not generous. Every promise had conditions attached. Every gift was arranged to keep somebody grateful or waiting. She called me sweetheart on our second meeting and watched my expression. I smiled and kept writing. That kind of woman always tells on herself eventually. David appeared beside her a few times, usually carrying boxes she did not want to lift. He seemed nothing like her. That was my first mistake. He was quiet where she was theatrical, patient where she was abrupt. He brought me coffee once when I was working late on one of her trust amendments, and he apologized for interrupting as if kindness required permission. When he looked embarrassed by Colleen's sharpness, I thought I was seeing decency. I thought I was seeing a man who had survived her without becoming her. I had grown up in a house where words were chosen carefully and sentiment did not announce itself. My mother died when I was 16. After that, my father and I loved each other in practical ways. Repaired gutters, paid bills on time, cut oranges into neat wedges when one of us was sick. David's gentleness felt softer than that life. I mistook ease for safety, and safety for character. It happens more often than people admit. By the time we married, I believed I understood the family I was entering. I did not. Colleen called me sensible to her friends. David squeezed my hand under restaurant tables when she corrected him in public, as though we shared a private language of survival. Looking back, I can see how much of his charm was accommodation. He had learned that appearing harmless was useful. So had his mother. They just used it differently. The house was my true inheritance. It had belonged to my grandmother, then my mother, and when the legal dust of grief settled, it came to me. A white clapboard house with a deep porch, old roses, and a kitchen full of afternoon light. It was the only property I owned outright. No mortgage, no partner's name, just mine. 3 generations of women had cooked, mourned, laughed, and waited in those rooms. When the deed was recorded in my name, I stood in the foyer and cried. What mattered most inside that house was the kitchen table. Scarred oak, uneven on one leg, too beloved to replace. That was where my father taught me to read bank statements like letters people didn't mean to send. He would spread out reports, tap a line with his pencil and say, "Read the pattern, not the excuse." A charge repeated too neatly. A withdrawal made where no one had reason to be. A transfer that arrived just after an argument. Numbers told you where power really lived. Whenever life confused me, I sat at that table until it didn't. David knew that story. He knew what that house meant. When I got pregnant, he seemed almost reverent about it. We painted the nursery together one rainy Saturday, him on a ladder, me on the floor with painter's tape and too much caution, because I was already protective of every breath around that child. We argued about crib placement, laughed when he found paint on my cheek, and held curtain samples against the wall as if such decisions were sacred. I believed we were building something honorable. Pregnancy softened me in ways I had not expected. I folded tiny clothes into drawers. I washed blankets twice. I chose a rocking chair that reminded me of my mother. Even Colleen behaved better on the surface. She sent casseroles, called to ask how I was sleeping, and offered help in that polished voice of hers. But there were small remarks that brushed against my instincts. Had I updated the deed after the marriage? Had I thought about putting the house into a family trust? David asked once if it might be simpler, after the baby, to put everything under one umbrella. I said no with a smile. He kissed my forehead and said, "Of course." At 36 weeks, the nursery was finished, my bag was packed, and the house felt full of waiting. I remember standing at the kitchen sink one late afternoon, watching sunlight move across the old table where my father had taught me how to detect a lie in columns of ink. My daughter shifted hard inside me, and for one brief moment everything felt aligned. The women before me, the father who taught me to protect what was ours, the child who would inherit more than walls. Then my water broke 3 weeks early, right there on the kitchen floor. 1 second I was standing in sunlight, and the next I was bent over the counter, breathing through a pain sharp enough to wipe every gentle thought from my mind. David moved quickly. He grabbed the hospital bag, helped me into the car, and kept his voice calm as he drove, one hand tight on the wheel and the other over mine. I trusted that hand. I remember that now with clarity. In the side mirror, after we turned off the street, I saw another set of headlights settle in behind us. Colleen was following in her car to the hospital. Labor did not go the way the classes promised. It came hard and wrong, the pain stacking fast, monitors multiplying around me, voices lowering in that professional way that tells you something has shifted before anyone says so. I remember a bright surgical light, the smell of antiseptic, David's face gone pale above his mask, and then too much blood. More than anyone had prepared me for. Someone called for a specialist. Someone pressed on my abdomen while another voice told me to stay awake. I did. Barely. When they finally put my daughter against my chest, she was warm and furious and perfect, and for a little while the room narrowed to that. I looked at her and felt the world divide cleanly into before and after. But my body had paid for that moment. I was weak, stitched, dizzy when I sat up, and kept longer than expected because my hemoglobin dropped and would not rise quickly enough. They said rest. They said fluids. They said not to worry if I felt foggy. As if fog were a small inconvenience instead of a theft. The first 2 days, David hovered. He brought ice chips, adjusted my blanket, texted pictures to people I was too tired to answer. He kept saying, "You scared me." I believed him. After the second day, though, something changed. His visits shortened. There was always a reason, each one plausible if taken alone. He needed to let the dog out. He had to meet a contractor about a leak I had never heard about. He needed to pick up medications. He was helping his mother with something urgent at her bank. Whenever he came back, he kissed my forehead and asked how I was feeling in a tone almost too careful, as if he were checking whether I remembered something. On the third afternoon, Colleen arrived alone. She swept in carrying a bouquet too fragrant for a hospital room and wearing an expression of polished grandmotherly pride. She held the baby carefully enough for the nurses to admire her, and long enough for me to notice she spent more time arranging the blanket for the camera than looking at her granddaughter's face. Then, while I was trying to reposition myself without pulling at stitches, she asked, almost idly, whether the house paperwork was still all in my name. I looked up at her. She smiled. "Only for the baby's future, dear. You know how important these things become once there's a child." I told her the deed had always been straightforward. She nodded as if that satisfied her, but she asked 2 more questions that afternoon than most loving grandmothers ask in a year. Was there a trust yet? Had I updated beneficiaries? Did David know where I kept the file? She made each question sound practical, even generous, but the timing was wrong. I had an IV in my arm, a blood pressure cuff bruising my skin, and a newborn at my breast. In my line of work, timing was never a neutral fact. Still, I pushed the thought away. I told myself pain makes ordinary things feel sinister. A night nurse unsettled me next, though she had no idea she was doing it. She was helping me shuffle to the bathroom with that humiliating postpartum combination of pain and gratitude, one hand under my elbow, when she said, "Your husband sounds busy. Poor thing was on the phone in the hall forever talking about a closing date." I remember stopping with my hand on the doorframe. "A closing date?" she shrugged. "Could be anything. He just looked stressed." It could have been anything. In another family, it would have been a refinance, a co-worker's problem, somebody else's house. I told myself not to start building stories out of scraps while I was still on medication. My father had taught me to respect evidence, not instinct alone, but instinct has its place. Mine had begun to turn its head. The next morning, while my daughter slept in the bassinet beside me, my phone buzzed with a text from my friend Marisa. She had been planning to drop off a meal when we got home. "Are you really moving?" she wrote. "If this is a bad time, just say so, but I heard from Jenna's cousin that your place sold." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. I typed back too fast, asking what she meant, and she replied with apologies and confusion. She had heard it at a Pilates class from someone who knew someone in real estate. I could almost hear my own voice in my head, stern and tired, telling a client not to trust gossip. I did the same for myself. Small towns manufacture narratives out of one sign in one yard. Maybe there had been some confusion with another property. Maybe David had spoken to an agent about insurance. Maybe. Weakness makes room for maybe. Room for. When David came that afternoon, he looked as if he had slept in his clothes. He kissed the baby's head, asked if I needed anything, then pulled a few papers from a folder and said he needed my signature for the baby's insurance enrollment and one hospital release. He said it casually, already uncapping the pen, as if paperwork in a hospital room were the most ordinary thing in the world. And in some ways, it was. I had signed forms every day since admission. Consent, billing, privacy notices. I was sore, exhausted, and still light-headed when I stood. I should tell you this plainly. I did glance at the top page. I always glance. But the print swam a little, and David turned pages briskly, tapping where he wanted the signatures. He said the insurance office was closing early before the weekend. The baby had started fussing. My breasts ached. I signed. That detail lived inside me later like a splinter. Not because I had been foolish, but because trust is such an ordinary act when you believe you are safe. He counted on that. He counted on the weakness of my body, the noise of the room, and the assumption that a husband bringing forms to a postpartum bed could not possibly be doing anything but helping. After I signed, he relaxed. Not dramatically, just enough for someone like me to catch it. His shoulders dropped. He smiled more easily. He even sat down and talked about paint touch-ups in the nursery, about how our daughter had my chin. If I had not noticed details for a living, I might have missed that shift entirely. But I saw it, and seeing it made me hate myself for a moment, because I still did not know what I was looking at. The doctors kept me until day 5. When they finally discharged me, David carried the bags and car seat carefully, called me brave, and eased me into the passenger seat. Our daughter slept behind us. After a few turns, I opened my eyes and saw we had passed the road home. Something inside me cooled. "Why are you going this way?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. The route David chose wound through 2 neighborhoods we never used, past strip malls and parking lots that made no sense. When I asked again why we weren't taking the normal way, he said something about construction. His voice was calm, but he did not look at me. The baby stirred in her car seat, a small mewling sound, and I turned to check on her because that was easier than watching his profile. When we finally turned onto my street, I saw the sign before I saw the house. A real estate lockbox hung from the front door handle. A sedan I did not recognize sat in the driveway, engine off, a magnetic sign on the door advertising a local agency. The hydrangeas my grandmother planted 30 years ago were still blooming beside the porch steps. Everything looked the same, and nothing was. David pulled in slowly, as if he could delay the next minute by letting the car drift. A woman stepped out of the sedan. She wore a grey blazer and held a clipboard, and when she saw us, she looked confused, then cautious. She glanced at the lockbox, then at David, then at me, holding a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket. And something in her expression shifted toward discomfort. She had clearly not expected us. I opened the car door before David could say anything. My legs were unsteady, my body sore in places I could not name, and I was still wearing the mesh underwear and oversized pad they give you at discharge, the kind of indignity you forget about until you're standing on your own lawn realizing your life has been rearranged without your knowledge. I held my daughter close to my chest and walked toward the agent. "Can I help you?" I asked. She looked at David, who had stepped out of the car but stayed near the hood, hands in his pockets. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Are you family? The Sellers said this would be vacant by now." The word Sellers moved through me like ice water. "This is my house," I said. "I'm the owner. What Sellers?" The agent's confusion deepened. She flipped a page on her clipboard, looked at me, then at David again. "The property sold 4 days ago," she said slowly. "The Sellers indicated it was a quick estate matter, a family transition, they said. I asked her to show me the paperwork." She hesitated. David stepped forward, finally, his voice too quick. "Sweetheart, let's just go inside and talk. You just got out of the hospital. You're exhausted. This is a misunderstanding." I did not move. I looked at the agent and waited. She handed me the listing sheet and a copy of the signed agreement. My father's training began before I finished the first paragraph. I had spent years reading documents other people assumed were too dense to matter. He taught me that fraud almost never hides in the obvious places. It hides in timestamps, in witness lines, in the notary's jurisdiction. I scanned the pages the way I had been taught, and what I found there made my chest tighten until I thought my stitches might tear. The sale had been executed using a power of attorney. The document bore my signature, or something close enough to pass a careless review. The notary was a name I did not recognize. The date on the power of attorney was the same day my daughter was born, and the timestamp placed my supposed signature at the exact hour I had been in surgery, unconscious, while a fetched specialist worked to stop my bleeding and save my life. I thought of the papers David handed me in the hospital room. The ones he said were for insurance enrollment, the ones I signed while groggy, while trusting, while my newborn cried beside me. He had slid a power of attorney into that stack. He had watched me sign away my grandmother's house while I could barely hold a pen steady. The listing named 2 sellers, David and his mother, Colleen, acting on my behalf under authority I never granted. I looked up at him. "You did this while I was on the operating table?" His face shifted through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, then something like fear, then a mask I had seen before on people caught mid-lie. He stepped closer and lowered his voice as though we were having a private disagreement instead of standing in front of a stranger holding proof of forgery. "You agreed to this," he said. "We talked about it. You said you wanted the money for the baby. You're confused because of the birth. The doctors said this might happen." My hands did not shake. I noticed that with a strange clarity. I was holding my daughter, standing in the driveway of a home that had belonged to my grandmother, wearing hospital-issue underwear, and my hands were completely still. A second car pulled up to the curb. Colleen stepped out, moving quickly, her face arranged into an expression of grave concern. She did not look at the agent. She looked only at me. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "You shouldn't be out here. You're not well. David, why didn't you take her somewhere to rest first?" She reached for my elbow, gently, the way you might guide a confused elderly relative away from a conversation she should not be part of. "Let's get you settled," she continued. "You've been through so much. This is all just a misunderstanding. You know how foggy those first days can be. I remember after David was born, I couldn't remember my own phone number for a week." She laughed softly, performed warmth, and looked at the agent with a small, apologetic smile. "Postpartum confusion," she said. "The doctors warned us." I understood then, with the precision of a document laid out on my father's kitchen table, what they had built. It was not just theft. It was a frame. They had stolen my house and prepared a story in which I had agreed to everything, but simply could not remember, because childbirth had made me unstable. If I shouted, I would seem hysterical. If I cried, I would seem fragile. If I accused them in front of witnesses, they would exchange sad glances and suggest I needed rest, medication, evaluation. Every reaction I might have would confirm the narrative they had already written. The agent watched us with the expression of someone who wanted to be anywhere else. I looked at David, then at Colleen, then at my daughter's face, calm and asleep against my chest. I said nothing. Colleen tilted her head slightly, waiting for the outburst she had prepared for. I let her wait. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. "I'm very tired." David's shoulders dropped. Colleen smiled with visible relief. "Of course you are, dear. Let's get you somewhere comfortable. There's a nice motel off the highway just until we sort things out." I let them guide me back to the car. I let David drive me to a motel I had never seen before. I let Colleen check me in while I sat in the lobby holding my baby, silent, still, watching them exchange a glance that said, "This is easier than we expected." They thought I had broken. They thought pain and exhaustion and the weight of a newborn had made me pliable. They were wrong. In my mind, I was already sitting at my father's kitchen table. I was already reading the document again, line by line. And I was already making a list. The motel room smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. A window unit air conditioner rattled in the corner, cycling on and off with a rhythm that made sleep impossible even if my body had been willing. I sat on the edge of the bed, my daughter asleep in the portable bassinet David had brought from the car, and I stared at the wall until the texture of it started to blur. For a while I let myself feel it. The betrayal, the sheer scope of what they had done. My grandmother's house, my mother's house. My house. Sold while I bled on a surgical table. Signed away with a pen I could barely hold. Taken by people who kissed my forehead and called me sweetheart. The grief was so large I could not find its edges. But grief is not a strategy. My father taught me that. I found a crumpled receipt in my coat pocket, left over from the hospital cafeteria. I smoothed it out on the nightstand and borrowed a pen from the motel desk. Then I did what he had trained me to do when everything felt impossible. I made a list. First, I wrote down what I could not do. I could not confront them. If I accused David and Colleen directly, they would deny everything and tighten whatever story they were building about my instability. I had no recording, no witness to the moment I signed those papers, and no proof that I had not understood what I was agreeing to. Confrontation would give them warning and give me nothing. I could not call the police. Not yet. A forged signature is a crime, but I had signed something. The power of attorney might hold up long enough to muddy the investigation, and by the time anyone looked closely, they would have rehearsed their answers. Colleen would perform concern. David would shake his head sadly. They would say I had agreed and then forgotten, and a detective would see a new mother, emotional, exhausted, and possibly confused. The he said, she said would bury me. I could not tell friends or family. Word travels. Colleen knew people. If I started making calls, she would hear about it within a day, and whatever evidence still existed would disappear into shredders and deleted emails. I sat with that list for a long time. The air conditioner clicked off and the room went quiet except for my daughter's breathing. In that silence, I heard my father's voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. "Never warn someone you're auditing." He used to say it when he came home from long days pulling apart fraudulent accounts. People who steal, he told me, get lazy once they think they've won. They stop covering tracks. They make calls they shouldn't make, send emails they shouldn't send, celebrate, in ways that leave a trail. The worst thing you can do is let them know you're looking. The moment they know, the evidence closes like a door. I had one advantage. They believed I was broken. If I stayed quiet, if I played the fragile postpartum woman they expected, they would relax. They would make mistakes. And I would be watching. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old contacts until I found a name I had not called in years. Martin Reeves. He had worked with my father for over a decade, a forensic accountant with a reputation for finding money other people insisted did not exist. After my father died, Martin had come to the funeral and pressed my hand and said, "Your father saved me once, and if you ever need anything, you call." I had never called. I had never needed to. I needed to now. It was past 10 at night. I dialed anyway. Martin answered on the third ring. his voice rough with sleep but alert within seconds. I told him everything in 2 sentences. My husband and his mother sold my house using a forged power of attorney while I was in surgery. I need someone who knows how to prove it. There was a pause. Then Martin said, "I'll be there in the morning, early. Don't text them anything. Don't post anything, and don't cry where they can hear you." I almost smiled. "I stopped crying on day 3, I said. "Good," he said. "Keep it that way. Crying is for after." He asked for the motel address, told me to sleep if I could, and hung up. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. My daughter stirred in her bassinet. I lifted her carefully, still learning the weight of her, still amazed that something so small could depend so completely on someone as hollowed out as I felt. I fed her in the dim glow of the bathroom light because the overhead bulb was too harsh, and I thought about what came next. They had counted on my pain. They had counted on the fog of hormones and blood loss and sleepless nights. They had looked at a woman 5 days postpartum and seen an easy target. I put my daughter back in her bassinet and picked up my phone. I opened the Notes app and typed a single sentence. Not for evidence, not for anyone else. Just for me. They think postpartum means stupid. I did not sleep that night, but I stopped panicking. Panic is loud and wasteful. What I felt instead was quieter and much more useful. By morning, I had a plan. The morning after Martin's call, I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I apologized. David arrived at the motel with coffee and a cautious expression, testing the air between us. I let my eyes go soft. I let my voice waver. I told him I was sorry for how I had acted at the house, that I did not know what had come over me, that the birth had been so difficult and everything felt blurry and wrong. I watched his shoulders loosen with every word. "It's okay," he said, reaching for my hand. "Mom and I were worried about you, that's all. We just want to help." I nodded and looked down at my daughter, letting him see a woman who had been broken and was now grateful for guidance. It was the performance of my life. That afternoon, Colleen called with an offer. She suggested I stay at her house for a while, just until I was feeling more like myself. She said it would be easier than the motel, more comfortable, and she could help with the baby while I recovered. Her voice was warm and measured, the voice of a woman who had won and could afford to be generous about it. I accepted. I thanked her. I let a small crack enter my voice, as if holding back tears of relief. When I arrived at her house with my bag and my baby, she greeted me at the door with an embrace that lasted exactly long enough for David to see it. She showed me to a guest room with floral wallpaper and heavy curtains, and told me to rest as much as I needed. She said we would sort out all the confusion about the house once I was stronger. She patted my arm and smiled. I smiled back. For the next 9 days, I performed the role they had written for me. I was tired. I was foggy. I was grateful. I apologized more than once for my outburst at the property, and each time I saw satisfaction flicker across Colleen's face like a flame catching kindling. David relaxed into a version of fatherhood that seemed designed entirely for his mother's approval. He held the baby when Colleen had her phone out, spoke softly about nursery plans he had no intention of keeping, and kissed my forehead in the hallway where she could see. I watched all of it. I memorized it. At night, when the house was quiet and my daughter slept beside me in a borrowed bassinet, I texted Martin from a phone I kept on silent. He worked quickly and carefully, the way my father had taught him. Every morning I woke to a new message summarizing what he had found, and every morning the picture became clearer. The notary who had witnessed my supposed signature was a 23-year-old woman named Brianne Hollister. She worked part-time at a salon and had no notarial commission in our county. Martin traced her through the stamp on the document, which used a registration number that belonged to someone else entirely. Further digging revealed that Brianne was the daughter of Colleen's hairdresser, someone willing to do a favor for a generous tipper and not ask too many questions. The notarization was fraudulent on its face. The power of attorney itself was a downloaded template, the kind available on any legal form's website for $12. It had been filled out carelessly, with witness lines that did not meet our state's requirements, and a statutory citation that had been outdated for 6 years. Whoever had prepared it, likely Colleen, had assumed no one would ever look closely. They had assumed I would be too broken to read. Martin followed the money next. The sale of my grandmother's house had closed for $440,000. That number lived in my chest like a bruise. The proceeds, however, did not go into any account bearing my name. They were wired instead to an LLC called Eastbrook Family Holdings, a shell company incorporated 3 months before my daughter was born. Martin pulled the filings. The LLC was owned entirely by Colleen. There was no family in it. There was no holding. There was only theft dressed in paperwork. One day after the closing, a separate transfer appeared. $50,000 paid from Eastbrook Family Holdings to David, listed as a consulting fee. He had been paid for his participation. He had been paid for handing me that pen. I read that detail on the screen of my phone while sitting in Colleen's kitchen, drinking tea she had made me, listening to her talk about a garden party she was planning. She mentioned, almost casually, that she would be managing the baby's trust from the proceeds of the house sale, since I clearly was not in a state to handle finances. She said it as though she were doing me a kindness. I nodded. I thanked her. I said I was lucky to have family who cared. Inside I was made of wire and patience. The hardest part was not the lies. I had expected the lies. The hardest part was watching David perform fatherhood in a house bought with money stolen from his daughter's inheritance. He would lift her gently, coo at her, tell Colleen how much she had his chin, and I would sit in the corner of the room, smiling, silent, knowing that he had sold her birthright before she was a week old. The rage I felt in those moments was so large it had no edges. I held it very still inside myself because if I let it move, they would see it. I let them believe I was healing. I let Colleen pat my hand and call me dear. I let David kiss my forehead at night before retreating to the master bedroom down the hall, where he presumably called his mother to report on my improving condition. I fed my daughter in the quiet dark and whispered promises I intended to keep. On day 13, Martin called. I took the phone into the guest bathroom, turned on the faucet, and listened. "I have everything," he said. "The notarization is provably fraudulent. The power of attorney doesn't meet statutory requirements. The money trail is documented. Account numbers, wire confirmations, the LLC filings. Your signature timestamp puts you in surgery. Their own bank records confirm the distribution. I can hand this to a prosecutor tomorrow, or I can hand it to you. The question is, public or private?" I understood what he was asking. A private confrontation meant lawyers, settlements, sealed agreements. It would be faster. It might recover the money without spectacle. But they would control the story. They would tell their friends I had been confused, that we had worked it out, that families sometimes have misunderstandings. A public confrontation meant witnesses. It meant their circle seeing exactly who they were. It meant Colleen's reputation laid out like evidence on a courtroom table, except the courtroom would be her own lawn. I thought of my grandmother's house. I thought of the kitchen table where my father taught me to read between the lines. I thought of Colleen pouring me tea and explaining how she would manage my daughter's money. "Public," I said. Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's hosting a garden party in 2 days. At a country club property she's been telling everyone she just purchased. I confirmed the rental agreement. She doesn't own it. She's pretending to, for appearances." Of course she was. "Can you be ready?" I asked. "I've been ready since your father's funeral," Martin said. "Tell me what you need." I told him. I needed the documents organized and printed. I needed a notarized affidavit from Brianne, who Martin had already contacted, and who was eager to cooperate once she realized she had been made an accessory to felony fraud. I needed a prosecutor present, one willing to serve papers in front of witnesses. And I needed a car that would make an entrance. "A car," Martin repeated. "She once told me that only serious people arrive in black cars." I said, "I want her to see me coming." Martin almost laughed. "I'll make the calls." That night, I sat in Colleen's guest room, nursing my daughter in the glow of a dim lamp, listening to the sounds of a house that had tried to swallow me whole. 2 more days, I could wait. The limousine turned onto the long gravel drive at exactly 3 in the afternoon. Through the tinted window, I watched the country club grounds come into view. White tents, catering staff in black vests, clusters of well-dressed guests holding champagne flutes and pretending the spring air wasn't too cool for bare shoulders. Colleen had spared no expense for this performance. She wanted her world to see her as a woman who had arrived. She had no idea how literally I intended to do the same. I adjusted my daughter's blanket and took a breath. The dress I wore was simple, navy blue, chosen because it was modest and because it would photograph well in court documents if it came to that. My hair was pulled back. I wore no jewelry except my mother's wedding band, moved to my right hand. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a woman who had prepared. The driver slowed as we approached the main lawn. Heads turned. A black limousine at a garden party was unusual enough to draw attention, which was the point. I needed witnesses, and I needed them watching before anyone could steer me into a private room. The car stopped. The driver stepped out and opened my door. I emerged slowly, holding my daughter against my shoulder, and walked toward the gathering without hesitation. The grass was soft beneath my shoes. The sun was bright enough that I could see the exact moment Colleen noticed me. Her face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, then confusion, then a practiced smile that she deployed like armor. She excused herself from the couple she had been charming and moved toward me with her arms already opening, her voice pitched to carry. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "You poor dear. You shouldn't be out. You're still recovering. David didn't tell me you were coming." She reached for my elbow, the same guiding gesture she had used outside my grandmother's house. I did not move. "I'm fine," I said. "I wanted to be here." Colleen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She glanced toward the limousine, perhaps expecting David to step out behind me. Instead, 3 other figures emerged. Martin came first, carrying a leather folder thick with documents. Behind him was a woman in a charcoal suit whom several guests would later recognize. Helen Vance, an assistant district attorney who had worked with my father on expert witness cases for years. She had a court reporter with her, a young man carrying a stenography machine and the quiet professionalism of someone accustomed to recording things people wished they hadn't said. Colleen's smile faltered. "What is this?" she asked, her voice still controlled but sharper now. "This is a private event." I did not answer. Martin stepped forward and addressed the gathering with the calm authority of a man who had delivered unwelcome news in boardrooms for 30 years. "My name is Martin Reeves. I'm a forensic accountant, and I've been retained to investigate the fraudulent sale of property belonging to this woman." He gestured toward me. "The evidence I'm about to summarize has already been provided to the district attorney's office and will form the basis of criminal charges." A murmur moved through the guests. Several stepped closer. Others stepped back. Colleen's hand had frozen at her side. Martin opened the folder. "On the date this woman gave birth, while she was undergoing emergency surgery, a power of attorney was filed transferring authority over her property to her husband and his mother. That power of attorney bears her signature with a timestamp of 2:14 in the afternoon. Hospital records confirmed she was unconscious in the operating room at that time." He turned a page. "The notarization on that document was performed by a woman named Brianne Hollister, who holds no valid notarial commission in this county, and who has since provided a sworn statement that she was asked to notarize papers she did not witness being signed." Another page. "The proceeds from the sale of the property, $440,000, were wired to an LLC called Eastbrook Family Holdings. That LLC is owned entirely by Colleen Mercer. 1 day after the closing, $50,000 was transferred from that LLC to David Mercer, listed as a consulting fee. David had appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face pale. He started to speak, but Helen Vance cut him off. "Mr. Mercer, we have your bank records. The payment is documented. I would advise you to say nothing further without an attorney present." David closed his mouth. Colleen, however, had not survived decades of social maneuvering without learning how to pivot. She straightened her shoulders and addressed the guest directly, her voice warm with manufactured concern. "I'm so sorry you're all witnessing this. This is a family matter, and my daughter-in-law has been unwell since the birth. Postpartum episodes can be so difficult. We've been trying to get her help." She looked at me with something that was meant to resemble pity. "Sweetheart, let's go inside and talk. You're embarrassing yourself. I had waited 14 days for this moment." I had held my silence through motel rooms and guest bedrooms, through tea I did not want and kindness I did not believe, through nights spent nursing my daughter while the people who stole her inheritance slept comfortably down the hall. I had let Colleen believe I was broken. I had let her believe she had won. Now I let her hear me. "You waited until I was cut open and bleeding," I said. "You waited until I was unconscious on a table with doctors trying to save my life. And while I was lying there, you stole my grandmother's house." Colleen's face tightened. "You put papers in front of me when I could barely hold my baby. You told me it was insurance. You watched me sign, and then you sold everything my family left me." I took a single step closer. "You called me confused. You told your friends I was having an episode. You moved me into your guest room so you could watch me fall apart." My voice did not waver. I was never confused. I was recovering, and then I was documenting. For a moment, the only sound was the breeze moving through the tent fabric. Then Colleen's mouth slipped. "You were never good enough for this family," she said, her voice suddenly sharp and unguarded. "I told David from the beginning, a paralegal with a dead father and a run-down house she couldn't even maintain. You should be grateful we managed your affairs at all." Several guests audibly gasped. One woman put her hand over her mouth. A man near the catering table set down his glass and stepped backward, physically distancing himself. Helen Vance looked at the court reporter and nodded. He was already typing. "Mrs. Mercer," Helen said calmly, "I want to confirm that you've just acknowledged involvement in managing this property and expressed personal animosity toward the victim. Is that accurate?" Colleen opened her mouth, then closed it. Helen produced 2 envelopes from her jacket. "Colleen Mercer, you are being served with a summons to appear before the county grand jury on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. You are advised to retain legal counsel." She handed the envelope to Colleen, who took it as if it might burn her. Then Helen turned to David. "David Mercer, you are being served separately on related charges including accessory to fraud and receipt of stolen funds." David took his envelope without looking at me. His hands were shaking. I shifted my daughter's weight on my shoulder and turned away from both of them. The crowd parted, not out of respect exactly, but out of the instinct people have when they realize they've been standing too close to something that is about to collapse. I walked back to the limousine. The driver opened the door. I climbed inside and settled my daughter in her car seat. I did not look back. The weeks that followed moved slowly, the way all legal processes do when you are waiting for paperwork to confirm what you already know. But the wheels turned, and they turned in my direction. Colleen was formally charged with forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. The evidence Martin had compiled was thorough enough that her attorney advised against trial. She pleaded to reduce charges in exchange for cooperation, which meant admitting in court documents what she had done. I was not present for that hearing, but Martin sent me the transcript. Reading her admission in plain typed sentences felt less like victory than like watching someone finally stop lying after exhausting every alternative. David faced accessory charges. His attorney argued he had been manipulated by his mother, that he had not understood the full scope of what he was signing. The prosecutor noted that his bank records showed a $50,000 deposit the day after my house was sold, and asked the court to consider whether ignorance was plausible for a man who had physically handed his wife forged documents in a hospital room. David took a plea as well: probation, community service, and a felony on his record that would follow him for the rest of his professional life. I received that notice on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the apartment I had rented after leaving Colleen's guest room. The court found that the power of attorney had been obtained through fraud and that the signature had been forged during a period of documented medical incapacity. The transaction was reversed, the title was restored to my name, my grandmother's house, my mother's house, was mine again. The LLC, Eastbrook Family Holdings, was dissolved by court order. The funds that had passed through it were frozen, audited, and returned. $440,000, minus legal fees and costs, came back to an account in my name. I sat with that balance on my screen for a long time, trying to feel something proportional to what had been taken and returned. What I felt instead was tired and grateful and unwilling to celebrate money I should never have had to chase. David filed for divorce. He cited irreconcilable differences, which is the legal language people use when they do not want to admit what actually happened. His attorney requested an expedited process, likely hoping to finalize everything before sentencing so the marriage would not complicate his case further. But there was a prenuptial agreement. Colleen had insisted on it before the wedding. At the time, I had understood it as her way of protecting David's future inheritance, and I had signed it without argument, because I had nothing to hide and nothing I wanted from her family's money. The prenup specified that in the event of divorce, marital assets would be divided according to fault, and that any party found to have committed fraud, financial misconduct, or breach of fiduciary duty during the marriage would forfeit claims to jointly held property. David had committed fraud during the marriage. It was documented, charged, and admitted in court. The prenup Colleen had designed to protect her son now protected me. David received nothing. I kept the house, the restored funds, and full legal custody of our daughter. His visitation rights were suspended pending a review that, as of this telling, has not been resolved in his favor. Colleen's social circle did not survive the garden party. I heard later, through Martin, that 2 of the women present that day had quietly removed her from a charity board within the week. Others stopped returning calls. The country club where she had hosted her performance sent a letter requesting she not renew her guest membership. She had built her life on appearances, and when those appearances cracked in front of witnesses, there was nothing underneath to hold. I did not gloat. There was a moment in the courtroom during David's sentencing hearing when I watched his face as the judge read the terms of his probation. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way a person looks when they realize the story they told themselves is no longer available. He glanced at me once, briefly, and I saw something that might have been shame or might have been resentment. I could not tell the difference anymore. Afterward, in the hallway, he approached me. His attorney stood a few feet away, watching but not intervening. "I didn't think it would go this far," David said. I waited for more. An apology. An explanation. Something that acknowledged what he had done to me, to our daughter, to the house that had belonged to my family for 3 generations. He said nothing else. I nodded once and walked away. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. I didn't think it would go this far. Not. I didn't mean to hurt you. Not. I was wrong. Just a calculation that had failed, a bet that had not paid off. He had gambled on my weakness, and when the cards turned, his only regret was that he had been caught. That is the thing about people who betray you. They always think they will get away with it. They plan the theft. They plan the explanation. They plan the performance of concern that will make everyone else look the other way. But they never plan for getting caught. They never imagined that the person they dismissed might be paying closer attention than they realized. They never imagined that the quiet one was taking notes. 6 months later, the kitchen smelled like coffee and morning light, the way it always did when my grandmother was alive. The old oak table is still uneven on one leg. I have shimmed it twice and let it stay crooked both times. Because some things are more honest, left as they are. My daughter is asleep upstairs in the nursery I painted alone. Soft yellow walls, white curtains, a rocking chair that belonged to my mother. No arguments about crib placement. No one else's hand on the paintbrush, just mine, and the quiet and the radio low in the corner. I did not mind the solitude. I had earned it. I do not have a husband. I have sole custody and a restraining order, and those two things together have given me more peace than the marriage ever did. Last month, clearing boxes from the attic, I found something I did not expect. A ledger book, old and cloth-bound, the corners worn soft with handling. My father's handwriting filled the pages. Columns of figures, notations in the margins, the careful shorthand of a man who spent his life reading what people tried to hide. I had not known it was there. I stood in the attic holding it until the light changed, and then I carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. I sat with it for a long time. I did not open it right away. I just let it be there, on the same surface where he had taught me everything I needed to know. He would be proud. I know that the way I know the table is crooked, and the roses need cutting, and my daughter's laugh is going to be the best sound I hear for the rest of my life. If you have stayed with me this long, I want to say something directly to you. Some people see a woman with a newborn and see weakness. They see exhaustion and hormones and a body that has just been through something enormous, and they see opportunity. But the same exhaustion that makes you vulnerable also makes you very, very still. Still enough to watch, still enough to wait, still enough to remember everything. I want you to remember this. A quiet woman is not a defeated woman. She is a woman taking notes, and they signed their own confession the moment they underestimated a grieving daughter and a new mother living in the same body. Whatever they took from you, a house, a decision, a piece of your dignity, the assumption that you were too old or too tired or too emotional to fight back, I want you to know that stillness is not surrender. Patience is not weakness. And the paper trail is always longer than they think. If this story found you at the right moment, leave me a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me when someone mistook your silence for surrender.